All right, thank you, Bonnie. Yes, we are very excited that all of you are here, and we are excited for our two talk today. So our first presenter, and actually they'll be presenting kind of together, but the first one I'm going to introduce is Sarah Lose, who is MS and is an exercise physiologist and the program manager of Dr. Ozioma Okonkwo's lab at the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And that lab focuses on modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. She conducts maximal graded exercise testing on research participants and coordinates the FAB and the LIFE studies, which look at the relationship between physical activities, fitness, exercise, and healthy brain aging. Sarah received her bachelor's degree in kinesiology from UW Clare and her master's degree in human performance with an applied sports science emphasis from UW La Crosse. So welcome, Sarah. And then our other speaker is Max Gaitan, and he is a research specialist and exercise physiologist, again in Dr. Ozioma Okonkwo's lab. And I do apologize for the mispronunciation of that name, but in his lab at the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at UW-Madison as well. He is the site coordinator for the EXERT study, which is a NIH-funded clinical trial of exercise training for mild cognitive impairment. Max completed a bachelor's in kinesiology and a master's in exercise physiology at the University of Virginia, where he studied exercise as prevention and treatment for metabolic diseases. He stays active by racing triathlons in Wisconsin and throughout the US. So please help me welcome Sarah and Max.
All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry, trying to figure out where my mute button is at this point. We're starting off really well today. So thanks for joining both of us. We just wanted to start off by having a little, slide up here with a fun cartoon. Oh, there it goes. Just, talking about how sometimes we want to exercise, but our body's telling us, do I really want to exercise and everything. So before we get started, just starting to think about what do you think of when it comes to exercise? How do you feel about exercise? What counts as exercise to you? Where do you exercise? Just start thinking about it as we go through the talk today. You can go to the next slide, please.
So, like Sarah said, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. Really glad to be joining you all today and talking about a topic that's, of course, near and dear to my heart and Sarah's. So you may be familiar with this quote. I think about it often because I think it has a few tie-ins with the field that Sarah and I study, and particularly with the direction that our field is headed. Because exercise physiology has traditionally kind of centered on studying the body from the neck down, measuring the heart, the lungs, muscles, and blood flow. But those things all move during exercise, so it seems a bit more obvious to study them. Whereas in recent years, there's been a bit more focus on studying from the neck up. But the brain is physically static. It's not obviously changing during exercise. It doesn't contract the way that a muscle does. So historically, it's been less studied. And it's only really been in the last decade or so that the effect of exercise on the brain and its kind of inner workings has really taken off. But there's another takeaway that I like from this quote as well, because there are really dozens, if not hundreds, of scientific studies showing that regular physical exercise extends lifespan by several years. But we actually are not going to be talking about much of that research today because we're more interested in health span and brain span than lifespan. And so what I mean is that extending lifespan is great, but extending the number of years of healthy mental and physical functioning may matter even more because those contribute to quality of life. So with that quick intro, I think we're going to give a short overview of the session that we have planned for today. Please go ahead to the next slide. And we'll start the presentation by kind of laying the foundation and talking about how the brain changes with aging. That way we can understand what constitutes normal brain aging versus what characterizes abnormal brain aging. And we can start to think about how to get people who are on track for abnormal brain aging closer to normal aging. Then we'll do a deep dive on physical activity, exercise, and cardiorespiratory fitness. And then throughout the presentation, we'll also have pauses for self-reflection and for group reflection when we'll think about how exercise fits into our own lives. Stick around to the end because towards the end of the session, we'll have a fun part, which is going to be an exercise break led by Sarah, where we can actually put all this into practice. And then to round things out, after we've kind of gotten our blood flowing, we'll spend some time thinking and talking about how exercise and being physically active overlaps with motivation and kind of prompts to actually encourage you to work this into your daily lives. Those are kind of a couple key ingredients towards starting the behavior of exercising regularly. And we're hoping that you will have found some new motivation from some of the topics that we've covered today during the presentation. So to wrap things up, we'll have a bit of a Q&A session. And from here, I'll pass it back to Sarah.
All right, thanks, Max. So yeah, like Max said, let's kick things off by talking about brain aging. And we're going to talk about, what's normal aging and abnormal aging. And if we're on an abnormal aging pathway, how do we get back to that normal aging pathway? So one thing to be very clear about is that a decline in cognitive abilities is actually a normal part of aging. What we're concerned with and what we're going to focus on today is an abnormal decline in cognitive abilities as you get older. So you can see there's two lines on this slide, and that red line that red line are individuals on the trajectory for mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. So they have a steeper, more rapid decline than what is seen in normal aging when it comes to cognition. And when they reach that dotted line of clinical impairment, that's when they've reached a point where they're unable to compensate for that decline. What's also important to note is that Alzheimer's disease is characterized by internal pathology that's accumulating in the brain over many years, likely decades, before clinical symptoms actually present themselves. And so it's the cascade of years of pathological changes that lead to the cognitive impairment and eventual inability to complete daily activities. So just really quickly what those main pathology are, there's two defining hallmarks for Alzheimer's disease pathology: amyloid plaques and tau neurofibrillary tangles. It's believed that the amyloid plaques accumulate first, then followed by the tau neurofibrillary tangles. And that accumulation results in fewer nerve cells and synapses in the brain, which then lead to structural changes. And then there's also a decrease in something called glucose metabolism. In other words, we can talk about this as a reduction in the brain's ability to utilize its main fuel source to function, which is glucose. Okay. Next slide, please. So just like any disease, there are different risk factors, that increase your risk for developing mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. Non-modifiable risk factors are those you can't change. This will include your genes, your family history, and the biggest risk factor of them all, which is aging. We can't change our genes, can't choose who our family members are, and we can't stop getting older, no matter how much some of us may want to do that. Can't do anything about it. Modifiable risk factors, on the other hand, are those which you can change. So you have control over these risk factors. Some major ones are going to be sleep habits, diet, which I knew we learned about in a previous event for this series, smoking, education, and what we're going to be focusing on today, physical activity. Next slide.
So I'm going to be delving in a little bit more on that last modifiable risk factor that Sarah mentioned, physical activity. This graph actually flips it on its head and lists physical inactivity, which is obviously the opposite You can see that category on the far left on this bar graph along the horizontal axis. But there are a number of other modifiable risk factors listed on this graph as well. And so from left to right, we have, of course, physical inactivity, depression, smoking, high blood pressure, obesity, low educational attainment, and diabetes. And then finally, to the far right, the taller bar graph is the combined impact of all these factors. And so along the y-axis, what we're seeing here are the number of Alzheimer's disease cases that could be prevented by reducing the prevalence of these risk factors. And so, for example, it's estimated that by reducing physical inactivity levels by about 25%, we could actually prevent over 200,000 cases of Alzheimer's disease. And if we did a great job and everyone addressed all 7 of these risk factors, the columns add up, and to the far right, we can see that we can reach almost 500,000 cases of Alzheimer's disease prevented. But what I'll point out here is that physical activity is actually tied to a number of these other risk factors, because physical activity is known to reduce depression, to treat blood pressure, to help with weight loss and control blood sugar. And so addressing physical inactivity could actually have a multiplied effect and impact some of these other categories as well. So just by addressing this one risk factor, physical inactivity, we actually impact 5 out of the 7 modifiable risk factors listed on this slide, hopefully getting us closer to that combined prevention column towards the far right. And so those ripple effects of physical inactivity are an important part of the effect of exercise, because people who tend to, or who pick up exercise also tend to pick up other kind of healthy habits, since one healthy habit often leads to another. So for example, tying exercise to eating healthier foods can be doubly beneficial. Another great example is stopping smoking, which exercise can sometimes help with. So given these few examples, you can see how exercise can maybe compound its benefits to reduce the risk of cognitive decline. Next slide, thanks.
All right, so we've covered some of the background now, and now we are going to dive in a little bit deeper and talk about the evidence demonstrating why physical activity supports a healthy brain. But before we get into that evidence, we have our first pause here for reflection that we talked about we were going to do. Max and I want to know, what do you do to keep active and moving? So if you want to go ahead and just write in the chat function, what are some things you do to keep active and moving? And like I said, we're going to be asking a handful of these types of questions throughout the presentation so that you can start thinking about how what we're talking about relates to you personally.
And as those are coming in, we do have a question. Are the risk factor numbers regardless of other non-modifiable factors? Example, genetics.
I believe the answer is yes. I would have to go back into the paper and double check that. But in the estimates that they were making, they weren't necessarily accounting for all of the other factors about people. There's a number of other factors that are non-modifiable that could affect them. So I don't believe that they were accounting for those. They were just estimating what would happen if we treated physical inactivity or depression, for example.
All right, so we have a lot of good activities going on in the chat here, a lot of walking, cycling, which makes sense. There's good cycling in Madison if you're here, even in Wisconsin. So all really good things to keep active and keep moving. So if we go to the next slide here, there are multiple terms that we've all heard, and a lot of times they're used interchangeably. And while many people do that, they're actually unique terms. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that they're unique terms and define how they are actually different. So let's start with physical activity. Physical activity is a behavior. It encompasses any bodily movement resulting in energy expenditure. So it's a pretty big overarching term. So this means physical activity can be taking the stairs, doing the dishes, walking to the mailbox, even as simple as getting up from your chair and walking across the room. So as you can see, not all physical activity is necessarily equal. Exercise then is a subset of physical activity. Exercise is physical activity that's planned, structured, and repetitive in nature would be things like a planned intentional brisk walk around the neighborhood, biking to work, or doing 10 squats, 10 bicep curls, and repeating it again 2 times. So you can see how that's a little bit different than just a general overarching physical activity. Fitness then is a measurable characteristic. It's your body's ability to do and maintain exercise. So it's actually a result of exercising. There's 2 different types of fitness. The first is aerobic or cardiorespiratory fitness. And this is fitness related to your heart and cardiovascular system and measuring how well your body utilizes the oxygen that's delivered to the muscles to perform movement. Think of activities that get your heart rate up. So an example, if you're able to walk 60 minutes versus 30 minutes at the same pace, those are different measurable fitness levels that you could think about. The other is muscular fitness, and this is related to your muscles and their ability to perform work and movements. This could be strength related, so lifting 20 pounds versus 10 pounds, as well as endurance related, so doing 20 squats versus 10 squats. Okay, next slide. So our next question then is, how do we measure each of these things? Well, in our lab, we use 3 techniques. The first is through self-report questionnaires. We simply ask someone, how much do you exercise? Or what type of physical activity do you engage in? It's beneficial because it's simple. It's really easy to give to a lot of people. However, there is a limitation because it's not directly measuring their physical activity, so it can be prone to some errors. But with that said, they're still very useful and have been shown to be reliable. If we want to get a direct measure of physical activity, we use something called actigraphy. Actigraphy uses a device called an accelerometer. You can think of it as an advanced pedometer. And what happens is an individual wears this for 7 days at all waking hours, so not when they're sleeping, and we're able to determine how much of their day they spent being active versus being sedentary, as well as what level of intensity that activity was done at. Lastly, then, we focus on measuring that aerobic or cardiorespiratory fitness, and we measure that directly with a maximal exertion graded exercise test. So simply what happens is an individual walks on a treadmill at a constant brisk pace. The test starts easy and progressively gets harder and harder until the individual is too exhausted to keep walking on the treadmill any longer. During the test, we capture everything that the individual is breathing out. We analyze those gases that they breathe out, and that tells us their cardiorespiratory fitness level. Cardiorespiratory fitness can also be assessed indirectly through different equations, but really we want to assess it directly to get the best measurement. Next slide. All right, so let's just dive into a couple research studies here just to give you some evidence of what physical activity can do for brain health. So the 2 studies I'm going to talk about here were both done by our lab, and they were done with individuals who were cognitively unimpaired. This first study used a self-report questionnaire, and so based on their responses, we determined them to either be physically active or physically inactive. They underwent memory testing and brain imaging. And from the brain imaging, we measured how much amyloid plaque they had in their brain, so that pathology. We measured how big their hippocampus was, and the hippocampus is the memory center of our brain. And then we measured the glucose metabolism. So again, the brain's ability to utilize its main fuel source, glucose. And what we found was that those individuals who were physically active had better brain health in all of those outcomes we measured compared to the individuals who were physically inactive. So let's take a quick look at this graph just to give you a representation of what this means. The red dots in line are those who are classified as physically inactive, and the black line and dots are those who are classified as physically active. So this graph is specifically for memory testing, and we can see that both lines are going down as we age, because as I said, a normal part of aging is declining with memory and cognition. But what we can see is that red lines, or inactive individuals, are declining at a much steeper rate than the individuals who were active. So this means over time, the inactive individuals are seeing a faster decline in their memory compared to those active individuals. We saw the same thing when looking at their hippocampus. So the hippocampus was shrinking more rapidly in those who are inactive. And then for amyloid accumulation and glucose metabolism, we actually saw no change over time in those who were active. So that meant they weren't accumulating amyloid over time, and there wasn't any change to their ability to utilize glucose, which are both really good things. Next slide. As I mentioned, the self-report questionnaires can have limitations. So we did another study, but this time directly measuring physical activity using that accelerometer device. So they wore the device for 7 days, and they completed brain imaging to measure their glucose metabolism. This time we went a little more specific with their physical activity groupings. Instead of just saying they were active or inactive, we broke them up into 3 groups based on how much activity they did compared to the whole group. So the individuals in group 1 on the graph there, so that 1 on the bottom, those were the people who did the least amount of activity. Group 2 were those who did about the average amount, and group 3 were those who did the most amount of activity compared to the whole group. Again, we found that those individuals who were more physically active had better brain glucose metabolism compared to those who did the least amount of physical activity. So you can see this in the graph. The bars are getting taller, which represents more glucose metabolism. In the image on the right there, you can see that the red and the orange colors means that the brain is utilizing more glucose. And so you can see a lot more red and orange in the image of someone who is active versus inactive. So overall, both studies are showing that physical activity, provides these benefits to individuals for brain health. Next slide. And then, so we focus on prevention in our center. So we do a lot of studies with individuals who are cognitively unimpaired. And a lot of the research for physical activity, specifically for Alzheimer's disease, focuses on the exercise portion of physical activity. But there are 2 studies that did look at just habitual physical activity in those with Alzheimer's disease over the course of the year. So this means they didn't provide any treatment. They just observed these individuals and measured them at one time point and then again a year later. And what they found was that those with higher levels of habitual physical activity had reduced cognitive change at the follow-up visit compared to those who were physically active or sedentary. So I want to make this clear. We are talking about just everyday physical activity, not even exercise, things like household chores, activities, and simply walking. And we're seeing these changes. So these are easily doable and attainable activities. One of the studies even found a dose-dependent response, suggesting that those who engaged in walking for more than 2 hours a week had a significant improvement in their cognition a year later. So not just less decline, but an actual increase. So it's really showing that just a little bit more activity in your daily life can make a big difference. Next slide.
All right, so exercise, like Sarah talked about earlier, is repetitive and it's structured. And because of that, it often kind of fits into people's lives differently than physical activity. Like she was just saying, physical activity can be just as simple as taking the stairs or, doing dishes or gardening. So whereas physical activity spans throughout daily activities, often people will need to actually dedicate specific time to exercise because it's not something that's happening constantly. And so the next section here is going to delve into how exercise helps brain health. So this model on the screen here demonstrates how exercise affects brain changes that are then associated with cognition. So researchers are still trying to uncover the details of exactly how changes in the brain pathology can affect cognition. But we do know that exercise has physical effects on the brain, and that ultimately it's the functioning of the parts of the brain that are responsible for cognition. And there have been a few recent developments in this area that are really promising that I'd like to share with you. It's become clear that the brain is actually capable of adapting much more kind of robustly than we used to think. It can do things like grow new brain cells. It can make those brain cells healthier and more efficient, and it can adapt the vascular system that supplies those brain cells with vital nutrients. So I'm hoping that you come away from this next section with kind of a renewed sense of purpose for exercising based on a deeper understanding of how exactly exercise may keep your brain healthy. So next slide, please. So there's a lot going on in this slide, and I'm going to walk us all through it kind of bit by bit. But it's no surprise that exercise gets the whole body involved. And then even though you're primarily using your arms and your legs and your core to power exercise, it does have other systemic effects. So behind the scenes is kind of a cascade of effects and signals that are released by your working muscles. And these signals can circulate throughout the body and pass into the brain. So on the top left of your screen, you'll see a cross-section image of the brain. And this represents research that shows that we can actually enhance the size of structures within our brain with exercise. So when you're exercising, as I mentioned, you're contracting and you're relaxing your muscles in a repetitive way. And that action stimulates your muscles to produce molecules that are called neurotrophic factors. And so the neuro prefix in that word means nerve and brain. And the trophic suffix means feeds. So what happens when things feed? Well, they grow. And so these neurotrophic proteins that are released during exercise help brain cells to grow. So coming back to the image, you'll see two small areas that are highlighted in yellow. And those are representing the hippocampus, which is the memory center of the brain. And neurotrophic factors released from the body during exercise seem to have an especially powerful impact on the memory center. So normally it's normal for the hippocampus to get smaller with age, but that process is accelerated with mild cognitive impairment. But in people who do aerobic exercise regularly, their hippocampus actually can increase in size. And we think that's a result of the neurotrophic factors stimulating brain cell growth. So going counterclockwise down to the graph below the brain, this graph represents how exercise can impact blood vessel functioning in key brain vessels. And despite the fact that it only takes up about 2% of the body's weight, the brain actually receives 20% of the body's blood flow. And blood delivers key nutrients and oxygen and then carries away waste products from the brain. But we know that blood vessels naturally stiffen as we age, and they cause blood pressure to go up. And because the brain receives such a high blood flow, it's vulnerable to increases in high blood pressure that occur from this blood vessel stiffening. So excessive blood pressure can cause microscopic burst blood vessels, but those blood vessels are critical for delivering blood supply to brain cells for their functioning. And without it, brain cells can die off and it can affect a person's cognitive functioning. But exercise training supports healthy blood vessels. The increase in blood flow during exercise causes vessels to become more flexible and to be more reactive to blood flow, help keeping blood pressure down. And a healthy blood pressure is less taxing on the heart and, of course, the brain. So you might notice that the lines on this graph are curved. And that's because adaptations in the vascular system don't happen in a linear fashion, and some aspects change at different rates than others. So I don't need you to remember the details or memorize what this graph looks like or know what happens first or second, but instead I just use it to illustrate that physical and cognitive functioning, just like blood vessel changes, don't necessarily need to improve in a linear fashion. And instead, you may adapt quickly at some times and plateau at others. So to the right of the graph that we've just been talking about is a picture of a nerve cell representation, and it's fighting off inflammation. And inflammation harms brain cell functioning. Inflammation is red, swollen, warm, and painful. You know it if you bump your elbow on the table. And those signs are okay in the short term because they indicate that healing is taking place. But if those signs continue in the long term, that's definitely not a process you would want going on in your brain. And in terms of brain health, we're concerned with this chronic inflammation, which increases risk for various chronic diseases and can instigate cognitive dysfunction. And inflammation and exercise are also related to stress. So stress is exercise provides kind of a beneficial form of stress because it's ultimately good for you. But the strain makes your body repair the strained areas from exercise and helps bring inflammation down. And exercise can counteract chronic stress that leads to the chronic inflammation we were just talking about by triggering the release of feel-good hormones. And those lower stress and anxiety, and they lower depression, ultimately supporting healthy brain cell functioning. Now, finally, going above the image of the brain cell that we were just talking about is a little diagram, and I'm going to walk you through. This graphic represents how exercise can improve fuel delivery to the brain. And the brain requires fuel and nutrients, of course, to provide many of its functions. If you stopped fueling the brain, it'd be like failing to eat. You'd feel tired and sluggish. And the brain's favorite fuel, as Sarah was mentioning a few minutes ago, is called glucose, because glucose is easily converted to energy, and it circulates throughout the body and the brain. And some parts of the brain are good at taking up this glucose, but other parts need a bit of help, especially the areas responsible for memory and learning. Now, the help that it gets is from a molecule called insulin. And insulin is a molecule that acts like a key for glucose to be able to enter the cells. But as we age, insulin can't do its job quite as well. And brain cells don't recognize the insulin key as well as they used to. It's kind of as if like a lock has rusted up and you need some exercise to provide some WD-40 to grease that lock. So exercise signals the brain cells to recognize the insulin key better, which then helps get glucose get into the cells so that it can provide fuel for cognition. So I'll call your attention now to the endpoint on the right of the graph, which is exercise, or excuse me, which is cognition. But the intermediary steps that we've just talked about, these 4 steps, they're all physiological. So that highlights that even though exercise has benefits on cognition, it's really through these physical changes within the brain and the body that this happens. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So we've done a deep dive on how exercise works for the brain. But what does that really mean for daily life? Well, we talked about how there's an important connection between physical changes in the brain resulting from exercise. But at the same time, you can't see or feel those changes. They all occur on a really tiny scale within your body. Well, one study conducted by Dr. Laura Baker and her colleagues among people with mild cognitive impairment aimed to find out what results from those changes. And they asked research participants to complete a 6-month study where one group did stretching exercise 4 times per week, while the other group completed aerobic exercise training sessions. And so among the people who did stretching, there was a decline in cognitive functioning. And you can see that in the light gray bars on this graph here. Over time, we expect a decline in cognitive functioning. And so this decline was typical. It's in line with what we would expect. But on the other hand, people in the aerobic exercise group tended to improve their cognitive performance, represented by the black bars on this graph. And so that result is really promising because even a small increase in the graph is much better than the decline that we typically would see. But this is just one study, and research specifically among people with mild cognitive impairment is somewhat limited. And so we'll go on to the next slide to see what's going on in that area. This is just a small representative sample of a lot of the promising studies ongoing right now in people with mild cognitive impairment with relation to exercise. And so there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov that tracks ongoing research studies throughout the world. And last week I searched the database and I found 48 studies on exercise and mild cognitive impairment. And that's a ton of work being done in this area, much of it being funded by major institutions like the Alzheimer's Association and the National Institutes on Health. So that means that more and more results are going to start coming over the next few years, and they'll deepen our understanding of how exercise affects brain health and then ultimately cognition. And that'll be important for helping the field become closer to prescribing exercise in a similar way to how your doctor can prescribe pills. We'll know more clearly exactly what dose and how to prescribe the exercise. So we'll get into some of those details about prescribing exercise later on, but I hope that for now you're kind of energized by knowing that all this important research is going on. So we'll go on to the next slide here. And speaking of prescriptions, I wanted to briefly cover this topic that I think speaks to many people's skepticism surrounding exercise, because exercise is not easy, is it? It takes time and it takes energy. On the other hand, taking a pill is easy, right? It takes almost no time, almost no energy. So you'd think that people would stick with taking a drug for cognition more reliably than sticking with their exercise regimen for cognition. But actually, a 2015 study found that that was not the case. So this analysis compared exercise research studies and drug research studies for memory loss. And the researchers found that people stopped taking their drugs, their pills to treat memory loss at a higher rate 40%, you can see on this table, the higher rate than stopping exercise, which was a 30% discontinuation rate. So on top of that, the effect of the drugs on cognition was slightly less than exercise. And so to me, that's promising because it tells me that the treatment, exercise, is more acceptable to these research participants and more effective. That also matters because exercise has whole system effects on the body and the brain. And even those other modifiable risk factors that we talked about earlier, like social engagement and obesity. And so while drugs come with many common side effects, exercise often lacks those negative side effects. And to be clear, that's not to say that pharmaceutical drugs don't have a place in preventing or treating cognitive impairment. They definitely do. But the point here is that exercise may be more approachable than you might initially think. So next, we'll go on to the next slide. Wanted to bring your attention to some of the benefits of exercise for mood. And as we wrap this section up, I thought I'd end with kind of a more tangible outcome than some of the physical changes that we were talking about before. We talked about how physical and physiological effects of exercise impact cognition, but you can't feel those effects. And I think it matters how you feel. Now, of course, everyone's going to feel differently from exercising, but there's a substantial amount of research suggesting that exercise makes us feel good. And so here are just a few examples of the emotional, mood, and quality of life outcomes that can result from exercising. We know that affect can increase, sleep, quality of sleep can improve, various measures of well-being and quality of life and anger control can all improve from exercising. And so, of course, who wouldn't want to feel those things? On the other hand, negative mood outcomes like depression, tiredness, stress, those all go down as a result of exercising regularly, at least on the whole. And so often it's not really about the amount of information on a topic that determines whether we engage in those behaviors at the end of the day or not. And so while I think it's important that we talked about all the details of what exercise can do to your brain, often it's instead how the behavior makes you feel. So I hope you can harness some of these feelings and think about how exercise might make you feel happier, sleep better, feel less fatigued, and have more control in your life. That way you might be more inclined to do it. So later today, when we're kicking off our talk about how to actually build an exercise habit, I'll invite you to think back to some of these findings and consider how exercise makes you feel. Because it may be tough at the get-go, but I think many of you would agree that after you start moving, you tend to feel better. So we'll move on to another quick pause here. I'd like to ask a few questions of you. We talked about several impacts of exercise, those being increase in brain size, improvement in blood flow to the brain, decreasing inflammation and stress, and improving fueling to the brain. And I'm curious if you'd like to share in the chat what effect of that exercise is most important to you or what you might feel is most motivational. I would tend to agree. I feel way less stressed after exercising. I'm seeing that many of us feel the same way. That's awesome to hear. Well, like I said, later on in the talk, maybe we can think back to some of these effects that you're sharing here and build on that when we're talking about motivation to exercise. Right, so pointing out that it's not only brain health that's important, but also physical health here. I think that's really nice to recognize that exercise can help us both physically and mentally. It's great. All right, so I think we'll move on to our next few slides here. And if we can move on to slide 29, that'd be helpful. All right. So we're going to briefly touch on cardiorespiratory fitness, which Sarah had mentioned earlier in the talk, as being distinct from physical activity and exercise. And I think it's important to do this because cardiorespiratory fitness is a characteristic that happens from exercise, but it's not actually a behavior. Well, basically, a few slides ago, we were talking about the effects of exercise on physical functioning and on the brain. But what good is increasing the size of your brain structures or how well those functions change if they don't lead to measurable effects on cognitive functioning? And so in our lab, we see exactly that cardiorespiratory fitness, this characteristic that happens as a result of exercise, is strongly correlated with better brain functioning. And so on this graph here, you can see on the horizontal x-axis, fitness levels increasing. And then on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you can see memory test scores increasing. And so we see a clear direct relationship between increasing cardiorespiratory fitness and improving memory test scores. And so that's important because it tells us that not only do we need to be physically active and exercise, but we actually need to tailor that exercise towards improving our cardiorespiratory fitness. And that's a major direction that our research studies are going, is determining what aspects of the exercise programs we can actually manipulate in order to best improve cardiorespiratory fitness, which we know is directly related to this cognitive functioning. So my hope is that in the last few minutes, we've given you a good amount of evidence to convince you that it's important to exercise, and maybe some motivation in the form of this evidence. But we know that motivation is only one piece of the puzzle to exercising. So after a quick note from Sarah, we're going to delve into putting all this information into practice throughout the rest of the presentation. Next slide, thank you.
All right, so as Max said, we've given you all this information about the benefits of physical activity and exercise, but I want to flip it around briefly here and let's talk about the problem with sitting, more specifically prolonged sitting and sedentary behavior. So over the years with new technology and culture shifts, we've begun to sit more often and for longer periods of time. I mean, we're all sitting right now looking at computer screens. So one study that actually used actigraphy on over 6,000 adults found that adults were spending 51 to 68% of their total waking hours sitting or sedentary. Now, that's a lot of time. And to put that in perspective, only about 5% of our waking hours are spent in moderate to vigorous physical activities. So we talk a lot about exercising, but as I just said, that's only a small part of our day. So what about all of the rest of our day? Well, it's very clear that being sedentary is a problem, but what's potentially even more detrimental is the length of time you sit uninterrupted. So prolonged sitting has been shown to increase risk for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality. And while there's not research to date on the effect of prolonged sitting on dementia specifically, its effect on these other health components make it important for us to talk about and to consider. So what can we do? Obviously, we can reduce the amount of time we're sedentary each day, but another approach is to break up our sitting time. And studies have shown that taking breaks while sitting reduces these risks compared to sitting uninterrupted for prolonged hours, even when the total amount of sitting is the exact same. All right, so the jury's still out if engaging in physical activity can counteract the negative effects of prolonged sitting, but one thing is clear, it's important to take breaks while sitting. So I think this is a perfect time and segue into us taking an exercise break because we've been sitting for, 30, 40 minutes at this point. So if you want to go ahead to the next slide here and one more. Thank you. All right, so there are a couple of things that you'll need for the exercise break, and hopefully you already have some of these, but if you don't, it's not a problem whatsoever. You can just watch now and try these exercises later on, but no matter what, just keep moving during this exercise break. That's the whole point of it at this point. And before we begin, know that there are countless exercises you can do to say, I'm going to a few here just for the purpose of the presentation and hopefully showing you it's easy to get moving inside your own home with little equipment, and even if you're low on time. So next slide. Let's start moving. So I have pictures on the slides I'm going to walk you through, but you can also look at the video of me and Max demonstrating some of these things as well. So before we jump into the actual exercises themselves, let's just get the body moving because, we've been sitting for a while. So, kind of stretch it out, bring the arms above your head. Yep, stretch out those shoulders. You can lean to the left, lean back to the right. We're not going to spend a lot of time in these, just getting the body moving before we do some exercises. And then let's do some neck rolls. So just moving that neck around in one direction and then moving it back around the other direction. Good. All right. And then let's just kind of shake out the legs. Give them a little shake. and bring those knees up towards the stomach. Again, just a little bit of movement there. And if you're feeling off balance, please hold on to a chair or anything, okay? Great. All right, so let's go on to the next slide here. Okay, so we're going to start off on some exercises for our upper body, okay? These are important for activities of daily living, like carrying and reaching for items. And the very first one we're going to do is a wall push-up, okay? This is an easy and great exercise that you can do anywhere there's a wall, okay? What you're going to do is you are going to put your hands flat against the wall with your arms extended. So imagine that there's a wall in front of me. My hands are flat and my arms are extended. And then you're going to put your body at an angle like you can see on the picture here, okay? Yep, and so just know that the closer you stand to the wall, the easier it's going to be, and the farther you stand away, the harder it's going to be. Your goal is to keep your body in a nice straight line and then lower yourself slowly to the wall. So your face kind of goes towards the wall and then extend your arms back out. And that is simply the push-up. All right, so try a couple of those, see how they feel, slow and steady. You can also, if you need to, if this is too difficult, put your feet in a split stance position. So that means you're take one foot, step it closer to the wall, and one foot a little bit farther away from the wall. That makes it just a little bit easier. Max is showing it in his video now if you want to see what that split stance position looks like. Okay. Yeah, and then you can mix things up by putting your hands closer together or farther apart. Okay. All right, I don't see a lot of people in their videos, which means that you're all working against a wall right now, which I love. So if you're all feeling good, let's go on to our next exercise. All right, we have a few we're going through here, so we're going to keep you moving throughout the whole time. So for our next exercise, and actually for our next three, we're going to be using those weights. So if you have any sort of weight, if you have a can, you know, I'm going to use water bottles because I'm at my office and this is all I have, and that's okay. All right, Max has got cans because he's in his kitchen. So grab whatever you can. So for this first one, for a bicep curl, you're just going to be standing up nice and tall, really good posture, and your arms are going to be straight at your side with the palms facing forward, okay? All you're going to do is bend the elbows, bring those palms up by your shoulder, and then bring them back down. Perfect. Yep, so then just keep doing a couple of those. Some modifications. You can do this sitting. Standing, you know, is great, but if you need to sit down, you can do that. You can also do less weight, more weight, whatever you need to do. And then you can also try one arm at a time. Some people find that easier, some find it more difficult. So you can just do one instead of both. And then if you really want to mix it up as well, you can change your wrist positioning. So right now our palms are facing forward. If you actually turn your palms so they're facing towards the center of your body like this, and then lift up, that's another way that you can do it as well. So there's a lot of variety for this, whatever's going to feel best for you. Okay. All right. I see a lot of great bicep curls going on. So we'll move on to our next exercise, but we're going to keep these weights, but now we're going to work our shoulders in a different way. Okay. We're going to do what's called a front raise. So we're still standing straight and tall. We still have those weights in our hands, but this time our palms are going to be facing backwards. Okay. So with our palms facing backwards, you're going to keep your arms straight and lift them up in front of you and back down. What's important is that you keep it so that it's no higher than your shoulder. Okay. Going up higher than your shoulder is going to put a lot of stress on the shoulder. So just make sure you're at shoulder level and coming back down. And we have all the same modifications that we just talked about for the bicep curl. Okay, you can change your wrist positioning. You can be seated if you need to. You could do one arm at a time if you need to. Okay. All right. Great work, everyone. See some really good videos right now. All right. Our last upper body exercise, again, weights still in hand. We are just going to do one other aspect with our shoulders. So this time, your palms are going to be facing straight in, okay, straight towards your body, and keeping your arms straight with just a slight bend in them. You're going to lift them out to the side. Again, no higher than shoulder length. shoulder height, excuse me, and then back down. And all those modifications we just talked about, sitting, one arm at a time, less weight, changing your wrist positioning, those are all different things you can do with this exercise. Okay. All right. Okay, wonderful work, everyone. How are we feeling after that? Hopefully pretty good. We've still got more exercises. That's just one portion. That was just our upper body. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to start working on our lower body. Okay, so you can keep those weights if you want, or you can toss them to the side lightly. Don't just throw weights anywhere. We are going to start with lunges. So with lunges, you're going to need a nice clear space in front of you. Okay, and what you're going to do, as you can see in the picture there, you're going to stand straight with your feet together. You're going to take a step forward, which I should probably move my camera here so you can see me. Okay, you're going to take a step forward. And then you're just going to bend down with both knees at the same time, come back up and step together. Okay. Then you'll switch to the other side, same thing, down and back up. Okay. So try a couple of those out, and some things to think about. It's really important that your knee does not go farther forward than your toes. That puts a lot of stress on the knees, and we don't want that. Ideally, both knees will be at about 90 degrees, like you can see in the picture on the slide here, but that's really not necessary. Just go as far as you can go. And then if you're having trouble with your balance with this, feel free to hold on to a chair on the side for balance as you do it, as Max is doing there. And then also if you're having trouble getting back up, so you bend down and then you're like, oh, I'm struggling to get back up. Next time, just don't go down as far. That's okay. Just go to what you can do and then stand back up. Okay. All right. Great job, everyone. All right. So our next two exercises are going to involve a chair. So if everyone has that stable chair that they can use for these exercises, that would be great. Okay. All right. So the first one we're going to do is chair squats. And for this exercise, the chair is going to be used as a reference point and really a safety mechanism. Okay, so you're going to stand in front of the chair, just a couple inches in front of it, just like you can see in the picture, and just like you would do if you're going to sit down in the chair. Okay, and all you're going to do is you're going to bend at your hips and then your knees. You're going to lightly touch the chair and then stand back up. Okay, so I don't want you to sit down fully on the chair, just lightly touch it and then stand back up. Okay. If you are having some trouble with this, there's two things that you could do. You could not go bend down as much. So you don't even touch the chair. You just go to what feels comfortable and then come back up. Or you could sit down completely. But if you sit down completely, so I sit down completely, I'm not going to use my arms to get back up. I'm just going to use my legs. Okay. And I see everyone has different postures with their hands, which is great. Put them out in front of you if that's going to help. Keep them on your hips, whatever will help you with your balance. And very last thing, keep those knees back behind the toes. Again, we don't want to put pressure on our knees. All right. Great squats, everyone. Okay. All right, so next exercise, we're going to be in our chair. This time we actually do get to sit down. Some exercises do require us to sit. This is one of them. So we'll have you sit down in your chair, feet flat on the ground. And all you're going to do is you're going to take your leg, extend it straight out in front of you, hold it for a second or two, and bring it back down. Then you're going to do the same thing with the other leg and bring it back down. Okay. So for this one, if this is, too easy for you, there's some modifications you can do to make it harder. You can use a resistance band. So you have some resistance to go against as you're lifting up your leg. You can also hold it for a little bit more than just a second or two. You could hold it like this for say 5 seconds and then bring it back down. Okay. The more advanced move would be to combine it with our next exercise, but that is pretty advanced, but we'll talk about that next. Okay. All right, one last lower body exercise. So this is going to be a glute bridge. Now this will require you to be lying on your back, so preferably on a floor or hard solid surface, But you can also do these in your bed or on a couch if that's easier for your mobility. So if it's hard for you to get to the ground, just go to the bed or to the couch. So you're going to lie flat on your back, arms at your side, and knees bent with your feet flat on the ground. And if you look at Max, he has his camera shown so that you can see what he's doing. And what you're going to do is you're going to squeeze your bottom, so squeeze your butt, and lift those hips up into the air. And you want to keep a nice straight line like you can see in the picture on the slide here, okay? The goal is to keep that straight line, okay? And then once you lift it up, then you'll just bring it back down, okay? And you'll keep repeating that. It's important that, you're not arching your back. You don't want to have strain on your back at all. And as I mentioned, if you want to combine this with the exercise we just did, the leg lift, you can combine them both to make it harder. Now, I will say that this is definitely an advanced move, so don't do it unless you're very comfortable with doing both of these exercises. Max will demonstrate though, just so you can see what it is. What you're going to do is you're going to stick one leg straight out, and then you're going to lift up the hips and bring them back down while your leg is still straight. Again, definitely an advanced move, but I wanted to throw it out there in case you wanted to make this a little bit harder for yourself. Okay. All right. So I see a lot of empty screens, which means that you're probably mostly on the floor, which is good to see, but we'll have you come back into your screens, but you're all doing really great work here. All right. And we've got one more round of exercises. Okay. We're almost there with our break. And these exercises are focusing on a variety of things like range of motion, your balance, and your core, which are all going to be important for activities of daily living. So our first one, we're just going to do standing one leg, and this is going to work on our balance. Simply stand up nice and tall, lift up one leg, and see if you can maintain your balance without putting the leg down. You can have your leg high. Oh, I can see you can't see. You can have your leg up high. You can have it just off the ground, whatever's comfortable for you, and just see how long you can hold this for. If you lose your balance and need to put the foot back down, that's okay. Regain your balance and lift it back up, okay? You can do whatever you need to do with your hands on your hips. You can have them in front of you, the side. Again, whatever is going to be the best for you. And as Max is showing, you can even lightly touch a chair if that gives you more stability. So we'll have you try that on the other foot now, okay? So you did one foot, now bring the other foot back up, and now let's balance on the other foot. So see how long you can do this for, and you can keep increasing the amount of time you're doing it. Other things you can do to make it a little bit harder is you can close your eyes. It's going to make it a lot more difficult, so be prepared for that. You can also use an uneven surface like a balance pad or even a carpet or a rug versus standing on, say, like hardwood floor. That's going to make it a little bit more difficult as well. All right, I see some really good balance going on. I don't see too many people wobbling all over the place, so I think you all have some good balance. All right, next exercise here. Let's just work on some range of motion, okay? So arms straight out at the side, just create some circles going forward, and you can create some circles going back, okay? So the bigger your circles, so if I'm doing really big circles like this, I'm gonna get more range of motion, more stretch of my shoulders, okay? But that can be, we don't want it to be painful, it can be a little difficult. So just start small to do, and then progress your way to getting to larger circles, okay? You can also put weights in your hands at some point too, if you would like to, but that is going to make it a little bit more difficult for sure, okay? All right, we are almost there. 2 more exercises to go. This next one is going to be an exercise that strengthens both your legs and works on your balance at the same time. And I would say all of you do this every day, and you might not even realize that it's a great exercise. Okay, so we're going to just climb some stairs. If you have a step stool or a flight of stairs, either one works. All you're going to be doing is taking your right foot, step up onto the stair or the stool, and then bring your left foot so that you're standing on top of it, so you can see Max. And then you're going to take that right foot, step back down, and then come back down with your left foot. All right, now you'll repeat it with your left foot. So step up, and then step back down, right? So with this, if you need to use a chair for balance, you can definitely do that. If you are using a flight of stairs, you can use the handrail if you need to do that. And then even if you just have a flight of stairs and not just like a step stool, just walk up and down the flight of stairs a couple times. Stairs are a really great exercise. So, all right. Good work, everyone. All right. Let's move on to our very last exercise we have here for you today. And this is going to be a plank. This is a great exercise to strengthen your core and help with your posture. It's one of my favorite exercises. And there's a couple different modifications. So I'm going to tell you about one of them, then I'll tell you the other ones, and then let's try them together. Okay. So the goal of this exercise is to keep your body in a nice straight line. If you're able and comfortable to get down to the ground, we'll have you go down to the floor on your hands and knees. From there, you're going to put your forearms flat on the ground. So you can see in the picture, he's got his forearms flat on the ground. Right. And when you do that, you want to make sure that your shoulder and your elbows are on top of each other. Okay, so you have a nice straight line from here to here. You don't want your elbows way out in front of you or behind you. You want it right in line with the shoulder, okay? Then from there, you'll bring your feet out, back, so that your legs are straight, and then you'll be balancing on your toes. It's just like you can see in the picture, and you want to keep a nice straight line, okay? All right, so for individuals that this might be too uncomfortable for, you can simply lower your knees to the ground. You're going to still keep a nice straight line with your back, but you're just going to drop those knees down to the ground. So you can see Max is doing this. For those who do not want to go onto the ground or have a hard time getting down onto the ground, you can use a chair. So we can see in the picture here, what she's doing is she is putting her forearms on the chair itself. Okay, so if you put your forearms on the chair itself, and then you bring your legs straight back and keep your body in a nice straight line. Okay, so you can see Max is doing this as well. Okay, the higher the chair, the easier it will be. Okay, so if you found whatever position is going to be most comfortable for you, I'm going to start the timer and let's see if you can hold this for 15 seconds. Okay. All right, so I'll give you all a couple of seconds to get into whatever plank position you find most comfortable. Okay, all right, so we'll start the timer in 3, 2, 1. So do your best to hold this as long as you can. Try to keep that nice straight line, so don't have your hips up in the air like a triangle. Don't have them sagging down to the ground either. Nice straight line. All right, you're almost there. And time. So just like that, 15 seconds. So, you know, if you couldn't make it the full 15 seconds, that's okay. If you only made it 10, that just means you have something to work towards, okay? You know what your starting point is. Next time, try to go half a second or a second longer, okay? All right, so great work, everyone, you made it. And that was only, let's take a quick look. That was only about 15 minutes out of your day, okay? And that was really quick exercises you can do. And a lot of the time you listen to me talking you through the exercises. So you can do even more in those 15 minutes. So hopefully you all had a good time. Let's move on to our next slide here. Actually one more. Oh, actually go back one more. Oh, sorry. This is what happens when I don't have control of the slides. In the chat, I would really love to have you all kind of write down how you're feeling after that exercise break. What are some words that come to mind about how you feel right now? Feeling happy, tired, things like that. It'd be really great to see how we're all doing. All right, we got a happy. I hope you didn't say that just because I used it as an example. I hope that's how you actually feel. All right. Wonderful. All right, lots of good words here. Strong, invigorated, more awake, more loose. Wonderful, wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that. So hopefully you can see that again, just 15 minutes you can feel a lot more energized each day. All right, so let's now kind of talk about how to attain benefits of exercising. We're talking about it, but how do you attain all these benefits we've talked about? Well, when it comes to exercise, we need to think about a couple different parameters. One of them is, what type of exercise are you going to do? Are you going to walk? Are you going to do some weights? Are you going to go swimming or biking? But there's other things we need to think about as well. So for example, how long are you going to exercise consistently for? Weeks, months, years? How often are you exercising each week? 2 times, 3 times? How hard are you exercising each time? Are you exercising, fairly easily, or are you working really hard each time you exercise? And then lastly, how long are you exercising for? 15 minutes, 45 minutes? These are the different parameters we need to think about to figure out how to attain these benefits. And they are, we're going to dive into what the research tells us are the quote unquote ideal characteristics of exercise training to attain the health benefits. But it is important, especially when first starting out, that each individual sets their own personal goals that will keep them progressing towards these ideal characteristics, because it's unlikely that you're going to just jump right in and be able to do these ideal characteristics right away. Okay, so we're all going to start somewhere different, so just determine what that is and then set goals from there. Okay, so let's talk about these. Next slide. There are 3 different types of exercise that we can, group into categories. The first is aerobic exercise. So this is walking, cycling, swimming, rowing. Think of that cardiorespiratory and aerobic fitness we talked about. There's resistance type exercise. This would be whole body training using resistance bands. Think of that muscular fitness we talked about. Then there is multimodal. So this would be things like stretching, balance, yoga, as well as resistance and aerobic training, because the purpose of this is a combination of these different types of exercises. And ideally, we would do all of these things, but in reality, we enjoy some of these things more than others. Okay, so the key is really choosing what you enjoy most, because that's what's going to keep you coming back to do it again and again. All right, so even if the exercise that you enjoy is not necessarily the one most supported by research. So for example, stretching may not have the same benefits as doing aerobic type exercise. However, it's still a great place to start because it may get you interested in doing other types of exercise. So we've had participants who did 18 months of stretching type exercise and never thought they'd want to do aerobic type exercise. And by the end of the 18 months, they really wanted to try cycling. Okay. We had other participants who were doing a treadmill exercise program, and then halfway through found out they really wanted to start lifting weights. So just because you do one type of exercise doesn't mean that's always going to be the one that you like. Just do whatever's going to make you happy and keep you moving. Next slide, Ben. Actually go one more back. There we go. Thank you. Yep, there we go. All right, so one of our next characteristics of exercise is duration. Okay, so how long should you be exercising for? And we're simply sharing this because it's important to be clear and transparent about what the research says is best. But we're actually would not suggest starting out an exercise routine thinking about how you still need to be doing this routine, 6 months from now. Okay, it's more productive to think of in short-term goals, like I'm going to exercise this afternoon, or I'm going to exercise 3 times this week. And the reason is that we as humans have a hard time planning too far in advance in the future. We're more likely to be motivated by short-term goals and short-term attainment versus the long-term. So rather than thinking about how good it will feel to be in a good exercise routine 6 months from now, just think about how good am I going to feel after I exercise this afternoon. So like what we just talked about, the exercise for 15 minutes, you felt strong, you felt more awake. Think about that. With all that said though, we can see from the research that benefits of exercise, at least in regards to brain health, does take some time. Okay, the research suggests that at least 3 months of consistent exercise is what's needed to start seeing these benefits. Okay, it's really important to note, though, that doesn't mean that after 3 months you can just say, great, I'm done. I don't need to exercise. I got my benefits. That's not how it works. Okay, you get the benefits, but then you need to maintain them. Okay, it's just letting you know it's going to take some time till you initially see them, but then you can maintain them as you continue to consistently exercise. Okay, and one other thing to point out about this is that all of these studies are a combination of different types of activities. So this includes aerobic only exercise programs, resistance only exercise programs, and exercise programs that combine both aerobic and resistance training. So type doesn't necessarily seem to matter when it comes to how long you need to exercise for benefits. Next slide. All right, so our next question is, how many days a week should I be exercising? Well, the research shows between 2 to 4 days a week is really all that's needed. This doesn't mean that exercising more days a week is bad. It's simply that the research just hasn't focused on any more than 2 to 4 days a week, given it's hard to get people to exercise one day, let alone asking them to exercise every day. So 2 to 4 days seems to be enough to attain these benefits. Next slide. And then our next question, how intense should the exercise be? So first, intensity is how hard are you working, okay? There's 2 quick ways to measure this without any fancy gadgets. The first is a talk test. So focus on your breathing and your ability to talk as a marker. If your breathing feels light, you can speak normally or sing, you're working at a light intensity. If your breathing's heavier and you can talk but you can't sing, you're at a moderate intensity. And then if you're breathing very heavily, you can only say a few words at a time, you're working at a vigorous intensity. Okay. Another is your heart rate. The faster your heart rate, the harder you're working. Okay. If you want to measure your heart rate, you can do it pretty easily. Just take your 2 fingers, put them just right underneath the thumb on the inside of your wrist, and you should be able to feel your pulse. And then you just count how many times you feel your pulse over 15 seconds, multiply it by 4. And that is your heart rate. Okay. So research does show benefits at all levels, but really that moderate intensity and above is likely what's needed to truly attain some benefits. Next slide. And then lastly, how long do I need to exercise each time? And this can vary quite a bit based on numerous factors, such as the intensity and type of exercise you're doing, and the amount of time you've set aside to exercise. And so the research can vary because of this, but in general, it should be about at least 30 minutes, if not more. And my one caveat here is we're all going to start different. I would not expect anyone to jump right into 45 minutes of aerobic exercise, at moderate intensity. That's not where you're going to start. Start where your ability is and then gradually work towards those goals. So next slide here. To wrap this up, this is just summarizing everything that we just talked about. And what's really interesting is that these fall well in line with the American Heart Association's physical activity recommendation guidelines that I'm pretty sure we've all heard at this point. 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise. So although those guidelines that are widely spread weren't made specifically for brain health, it looks like brain health benefits come from those. So that's really nice to see. And my last caveat, it's important that you please consult with your physician before starting any exercise program so they can discuss safety and appropriateness with you based on your personal circumstances, okay? All right. I simply want to know, do you exercise currently? Yes or no? If you just want to put it in the chat, I just want to get an idea of who we've got in our audience here, okay? And so I see a lot of yeses, which doesn't surprise me too much. You're all doing really good with their exercise break there. But still some no's and some's. Good. All right. Well, when it comes to implementing exercise, it always seems to be a lot easier said than done. So we've talked about all of these great benefits, yet why is it so difficult for so many people to do it? We'll go to the next slide and we'll find out. There we go. barriers. All right, there are a lot of barriers to exercise, okay? They can be specific to certain groups like caregivers, or they can be universal to just about everyone. But regardless of who the barriers affect, they can typically fall into a few different categories. So our social and support-based barriers, logistical barriers, psychological, attitude-based, financial, and physical barriers. Okay, so next slide. In the chat here, type in some barriers that you face to exercising, or maybe barriers that you might not face, but you think others might face. All right, time, pain, long work hours. Wisconsin winters, yes, that is definitely a barrier. Lack of habit, oxygen levels, yes, these are all definitely barriers that people are facing. So if we want to go to the next slide here, you know, many of what you have put in here are actually going to be listed on this slide. And I know it's a busy slide. All of the barriers that we list here are actually from research looking into this very question, specifically for individuals with MCI or AD and their caregivers. So overall, you know, you can see that, you know, not many of these barriers fall into just one single category. In fact, most of them are in at least two categories, meaning they're complex, there's multiple layers to barriers, and they're all kind of interconnected like a web. Another important thing to note here is that individuals with MCI and AD and their caregivers can actually experience some of the same barriers. So things like feeling like there's a lack of time, isolation, both socially and geographically, and depression, to name a few. But there's also going to be different barriers that are unique to their situation. So for example, caregivers might not have anyone available to watch the care recipient. Whereas patients with MCI or AD can be inhibited in what they can and cannot actually do by their disease severity or behavioral symptoms. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of these. I'm just going to touch on a couple here that I think are important. First one being a lack of time. And this might be the biggest and most well-documented barrier, because this one barrier is affected by and affects numerous other barriers, okay? It's especially true for caregivers, but it's actually also widely noted among individuals with MCI and AD. So it often, though not always, comes from a lack of prioritization, not necessarily a lack of time. So think about what commitments you already have. Some are non-negotiable, whereas others can be prioritized. Exercise may also be more time-consuming and possibly more fatiguing for an individual with MCI or AD, so that needs to be considered as well. And then lastly, for caregivers specifically, prioritization is not always the case. Between caring for the recipient, chores, me time, there's little time to do much else. It's also worsened for those who still have a job. So on average, family caregivers can provide 70 hours a week of caregiving with no formal help. And that alone exceeds the time commitment of a full-time job, okay? Another barrier then is being unsure how to start, okay? So exercise can be intimidating if you've not done it before or you haven't created a habit out of it. And so as we discussed, there's all these characteristics of exercise we have to think about. So that can be overwhelming, okay? So not knowing what to do when you go to the gym, or even worse, not knowing what to do even just while you're at home, can have a big toll on your motivation to begin exercising. So you may be mentally and physically prepared to exercise, but the actual act of beginning the exercise is usually where the problem can be. And this can be a bigger hurdle if your family, friends, or support network also have that lack of exercise knowledge or experience. And then lastly, fatigue. Fatigue can be mental or physical. It comes from being overworked or, participating in things that are physically demanding. And as we know, exercise takes a lot of energy. So when your mind and or your body don't feel ready or capable of exercising, initiating an exercise session can be particularly difficult. So it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge we are going to face barriers to exercise, and they're going to come in all shapes and sizes. And without doing that, overcoming the barriers is going to be an even bigger challenge. So if we go to the next slide, Max will take over here.
All right, so let's talk about overcoming some of those barriers. So you all participated in the chat and had some ideas about what makes exercise difficult, but I'm hoping that next you can contribute in the chat to what you think makes exercise easier. What are some facilitators for you? And while people are responding, we can move on to the next slide and see what aligns here. Again, a busy slide, but we're going to highlight just a couple that are maybe most salient here. So saying routine, exercising with friends in a group, having a companion exercise, a convenient location, that makes quite a lot of sense. Again, seeing exercising with others or with a trainer, I would absolutely agree with all those. So it's interesting that you're highlighting some of the same findings on this slide that are based on actual empirical research. I think that's kind of nice. So again, no need to focus on the specifics of where these categories overlap and which specific facilitators fall into 2 groups versus 3. But the point that I'll make here is that with this graphic, there is a lot of overlap between the things that can make exercise easier to do. And focusing on just 1 or 2 can have a real compounding effect on you if you focus on them that are most relevant to your situation. And there's one that I'd really like to highlight today that I think can be particularly useful and a great tool that maybe you can carry forward after the presentation today. And that's an exercise journal. So an exercise journal can be something really simple, just a few columns and 1 row per exercise session, where you write down when you exercised, maybe it's the date or the time, a description of what you did for the exercise and how you felt. So we'll go on to the next slide to show an example of one that I drafted up this week. And so here's an example. As you can see, the entries are really minimal. There's a column for date, description, and feeling. And so it can take just 30 seconds to fill this out, either right after your exercise or maybe before you go to bed that night. But it can make a big difference in terms of your accountability to yourself. Because by logging each date you exercise, it serves as kind of a cue to keep up your exercise streak. And to make that feeling of accomplishment tangible. You can see that you actually exercised. And by recording how you felt from your exercise sessions, you might be able to encourage yourself the next day to actually exercise again. It might cue you or help you remember how you felt after that session. I know that I felt great after our exercise break a few minutes ago, but probably by this afternoon, I might have forgotten exactly how that felt. So having kind of a written record can really help prompt you the next time. It can also just be a good visual reminder if you leave this somewhere where you pass by most days. Say you leave it on the kitchen table or next to your bedside. If you're seeing it regularly, it might be a good visual prompt that you want to exercise that day. And so next we'll skip ahead to the next slide. Another one that I'd like to highlight here that many of you actually pointed out in the chat too, is that exercising as a pair or in a group can be a real benefit as well. And so whether you have one exercise partner or multiple, I've seen this work many times, both in research settings and out in the real world. And your exercise partner could be your trainer, could be a friend or even a caregiver. And I particularly like that last example because I think when care recipients and caregivers exercise together, you're kind of doubling the good impact. But beyond that, exercising with others just makes people feel good. Having an exercise partner can help you stay accountable. It makes it tough to, the idea of skipping an exercise session because not only are you letting yourself off the hook, but you're leaving your partner hanging too. And not to mention the social interaction from group or partner at exercise can really boost your mood and make the exercise itself more enjoyable. So I'd encourage each of our audience members today to think for a moment about whether there's someone in your life who you could make into your exercise partner and consider reaching out to them later on to suggest that idea. These days, of course, it may need to be someone who already lives in your household in order to adhere to COVID precautions. But even if you're not able to get together in person with your exercise partner, it could be someone that you consider scheduling a post-exercise session phone call with so that you still get the same kind of accountability benefit and the same social interaction from partnering up on this. All right, we'll move on to the next slide for one last pause where I'd like to invite you to comment on the chat. Just throw out something about exercise that that you find to be your favorite thing about exercising. Feel free to comment in the chat. Having a dog. Oh, that might have been from the facilitators a moment ago. I know that for me, my favorite thing about exercising is how it makes me feel afterwards. I know even if I'm having a rough day, I can go out for a run, or I can take a walk, or a quick strength session, do some planks. And I know that I'll feel better afterwards. So I'm seeing a handful of answers that are along those lines: feeling better, how I'm feeling afterwards, feeling more vigorous and energetic. And I noticed that not any of you have said that it makes your hippocampus grow bigger, or that it improves your cerebral blood flow, or that it decreases the inflammation in your brain. Those things that we talked about earlier in the session today. And I think that's interesting, because you may think that those big picture health factors that result from exercise would be the reason that we go to exercise. But actually, I think it's rarely the case that that's true. Often we exercise for these more immediate reasons, like feeling better, or that you were prompted by the note on your calendar or your exercise journal, or the commitment that you made to your friend to go exercising together. So I think it's nice to think about the motivation factor of exercise, but next, let's actually talk about the practical nudges and kind of prompting to get exercise into your daily life. So I have two techniques that are my favorites that I'd like to share with you in order to help you get moving. And I like to think of these as nudges that will kind of prime you for exercise. So we can actually do this first one together. And the first one is called visualization. This idea comes from guided imagery. And so I'd invite you to find a comfortable position. If you'd like to join in with this, close your eyes, calm your breathing down to a nice relaxing rhythm, and then visualize the exercise that you're intending to do either this afternoon or tomorrow or whenever the next time you intend to exercise is. Maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's doing some of the same exercises that we did with Sarah a few minutes ago. And as you're visualizing this, think about what you look like when you're doing the exercise. Are you walking tall? Are you doing multiple repetitions of lifting your weight? Are you holding yourself up on a plank? And then also think in terms of each of your senses. This will add detail to your visualization. So think about what you hear while you're exercising. What do you smell? Think about how you feel. Maybe you taste something. Maybe you taste the taste of sweat. And then finally come back to thinking about what it looks like for you to be exercising. So you can continue breathing slowly throughout this and thinking about each of your senses and what it would feel like to exercise. And I find that doing this kind of visualization at a set time in the day, maybe it's right when you wake up in the morning, maybe it's right before you intend to go out to exercise, I find that it can help nudge you towards actually following through and doing the exercise. So we'll come out of that and into the next nudge that I'd like to highlight. This is one that I particularly like, and I use it all the time with myself, especially after getting home from a work day. Maybe I'm feeling tired and not feeling like going out to exercise, even though I know it'll make me feel better. Maybe I'm just exhausted. But this nudge is to just put on my exercise clothes. And that's the only goal of this one. The goal is not to think about what exercise we're going to be doing. It's really just to put on my exercise clothes and put on my shoes. And sometimes I find that that physical nudge can really help me going. Because getting dressed to exercise is kind of a cue to tell my body that, hey, it's time to get moving. So think about what clothing you need to exercise. Maybe it's just a pair of shoes. Maybe it's a hat. Maybe you're going outside, so you need some sunscreen. And the key to this strategy, even though you might not feel like exercising, is just to put those clothes on and have that be the ultimate goal. If you still don't feel like exercising after putting on those clothes, that's okay. Just allow yourself to take a pass on the workout. And just celebrate the success that you put on your exercise clothes and took that small step. So, if you're like me, you might find that once you're dressed and ready to go, that's all it's taken. And I hope that's the case. So we'll move on to the next slide to wrap up the session today. Kind of coming back to motivation, because I do think that motivation is important, even though those physical nudges and the visualization can be really helpful. I'd like to kind of wrap things up by talking about how we like to think of exercise as medicine. And that's because people get the most benefit physically and mentally just when they take their exercise, kind of like a pill at regular doses and regular intervals. But it's hard to do that. And so sometimes combining the prompts and nudges with thinking about the motivation for exercise can be really helpful. It's not the same thing as taking a pill, of course, right? Exercising takes motivation, and motivation can rise and fall. And so when that happens, in addition to these action-oriented kind of nudges and facilitators, thinking about motivation with two strategies can be helpful. The first is thinking about the why of exercise. And we've already done plenty of that throughout the session today. Earlier, covering a number of the physical changes that happen during exercise to the brain. And we also covered some of the mood and the well-being effects. So if you find yourself unsure about going out for your exercise session, in addition to those nudges and prompts, maybe just trying to remind yourself of the why of exercise. Thinking about what benefits you're going to get long-term, and then also how you're going to feel right after the exercise session. You'll probably feel a lot happier and healthier right afterwards. And just as important as thinking about the why is to start small. And Sarah had mentioned this earlier during the exercise break as well, where it's not necessary, especially at the outset, to go ahead and tackle 150 minutes a week of exercise. It's important to start small and just build the habit. And I know that today we spent some time talking about how exercise is ideally done for certain durations or specific intensities. But until those things are a full habit, it's best to start small. So think about what's one tiny exercise action you can take to boost yourself. Maybe it's 2 push-ups. Maybe it's a 3-minute walk to the end of the driveway. Start small, build the habit, and think about what you can tie that habit to throughout the rest of your day that's already habit. Everyone wakes up in the morning, right? Everyone say brushes their teeth. And so we have some routines that we might not even realize that we could tie exercise to just by starting small again. Finally, on the right side of this slide, we see a number of arrows that kind of call back to the vascular graph that I had showed you earlier in the session. And I highlight this again because I think it can be useful. We don't need to pay attention to the details of where the arrows are going, but I think it can be useful to recognize that these changes are not necessarily going to be immediate, but they are happening. So if you start to feel your motivation dwindling, think back to how changes are going to be happening at different times, and sometimes you might feel like you're plateauing, and other times you might feel like you're really getting a boost over the course of a week or two from exercising. And each of these changes is going to have their own slope. So if you're feeling like you're hitting a plateau, definitely think back to following on those nudges and prompts to get moving, like visualization and getting dressed to exercise. But then, you can also lean on the why and starting small with exercise. So if we'll go on to the next slide, just for a couple ideas of how to get moving, starting small again. It can be as simple as taking the stairs, parking farther away from the grocery store, for example. While you're watching TV, maybe you're stretching as well. Just taking these really small actions can be very helpful in terms of building an exercise and physical activity habit into your daily lives. So before we turn into the Q&A session of today's presentation, I'll just ask you all one more question. Feel free to chime in the chat if you'd like. But I'd encourage you to think about what habit you already have in your daily life that you could tie exercise to. As I said, maybe it's something as simple as brushing your teeth. That's a habit. And then if you want to build an exercise habit, you might follow up brushing your teeth with doing a couple push-ups or taking that 3-minute walk. Just something small to start. So feel free to chime in the chat if you'd like to. And then afterwards, we'll move into our Q&A session. I suppose I'll go ahead and share one of my habits is I know when I get back from the office after the day, I walk in and I take off my work shoes and I put on my exercise shoes. That's my habit. The cue of walking into the apartment after a long day of work is my cue to put on my exercise shoes. So waking up and stretching immediately, yep, that's a good one. Marching in place while waiting for water to boil, I like that. Yep, closing the laptop and taking the dog out for a walk. Yep, and combining exercise while watching TV. That's a great 2-for-1. Excellent. Love to hear all these. Well, I think we'd like to turn it over to you all for a Q&A session. Hope you've taken something from this presentation that you can move forward with to becoming more physically active and exercising and building those habits into your daily lives.
Thank you so much, Max and Sarah. I greatly appreciate you coming and sharing your knowledge today. And I feel like I now need to build that exercise break into my day at the office. So if any of my colleagues ask why I'm doing this, I'm going to blame you guys. So just be prepared. If anyone has questions, please go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself and ask the question as well. And while you're thinking of questions, we will be sending out little packages to everybody who attended today. It probably will take 2-3 weeks to get there, but you're going to be getting your own workout towel that you can use when you build up that sweat. And then we have little workout to go books that are put together by the National Institute on Aging. And so this already has a lot of the exercises that we did with Sarah today in an order for you. So if you don't want to have to think about what to do, you can go ahead and just follow this. Plus we have, some of you may have seen the red book that talks about exercise and physical activity. So we'll be sending you those items in the mail to supplement what you've learned today and to encourage you to sweat and wipe it off. We do have a comment, Max and Sarah, thank you for this presentation. We have a question. I just have to scroll back up. Can you talk a bit more about intensity? The emphasis seems to be just on moving more, but did the studies measure general activity or aerobic intensity exercise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so a lot of our focus was on just getting moving. And part of that is because that's the first step to even getting you to exercise. You know, if you're not going to, just start moving, how are we going to get you to, exercise at a high intensity, for 30 minutes? So this is kind of just getting you started. But once you get past that and you're really starting to exercise, you're wanting to exercise, intensity does, matter a little bit. Like I said, the research showed that for like aerobic type activities, you could do light, moderate, or vigorous intensity to get some benefits, but really working at least moderately intense. So again, this is getting your heart rate up, your breathing's a little bit heavier, but you can still talk, you just can't sing. Getting to that level or even more intense than that is really what's going to provide the benefit. But you also have to realize the more intense your exercise, you might not be able to do it for as long. So there's going to be a little bit of a trade-off and balance, and that's why we progress. Okay, so right now you might be able to do 20 minutes of aerobic exercise at moderate intensity, but the goal then would be, maybe a month from now, you can bump that up to 30 minutes because you'll have created these benefits that allow you to increase your fitness from continuing that exercise. So I hope that helped answer your question.
We have a comment, came up with another idea of how to get moving more regularly. Another comment, thanks for reaching out to us in the community, especially during COVID. We have a question. What is the relationship of the brain and balance?
I think I can start talking about that. Be happy to have others chime in if they have to add, but I think, we talk a lot about how exercise can help cognition with the brain. But we also know, especially with aging and in particular with cognitive decline, that the brain function or functioning declines as well in terms of things like balancing, in terms of controlling bodily movement. It's not just cognitive functioning that goes down. And so I think it's important to highlight that exercising areas like balance can be really helpful to maintain those functions that we might see otherwise decline. So I do think that there's an important point to be made for practicing balance as we age, not just for the cognitive benefit, but also for brain health.
Thanks, Max. We have a question. Based on age, where can I find exercise ranges? So walking average a mile in 20 minutes as an example, or how long should I be able to hold a plank?
That's a really good question. You can find some of these things online just by doing a quick Google search. I know there might be other references, but for whatever reason, it's skipping my mind. Maybe Max can jump in on that. But my one comment on this is, regardless of what it says you should be doing, based on your age, so normative data, based on other people that are your age, you fall within this percentile, that's kind of what we're talking about right here. I think what's really important is yourself, looking at yourself. How did you progress? Where did you start at? And what can you get to make those goals? But obviously having some normative data can help you with those goals. Max, can you think of it? I'm just blanking right now.
Yeah, I would just add that there is normative data that's published in the scientific literature that's not terribly accessible to the general public, unfortunately. But I do know that the NIH has a physical activity page that I believe may include some of these tables so that you can kind of track where you are in relation to, say, the average 65-year-old, for example. I wish I could be more specific, so please do feel free to follow up with us if you need more resources after the talk today.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and look at some of the NIH pages and try to put some resources that would best answer that in the email that I send out as a follow-up to everybody who came today. We have another question. Is the talk test better than a heart rate goal?
I'd be happy to start talking about that. I suppose I can't necessarily comment on which one is definitively better, but actually I would probably favor the talk test over a heart rate goal in many cases, particularly if you're not using a heart rate monitor on a regular basis, because otherwise heart rate can fluctuate day to day depending on hydration status, stress levels, and all sorts of things. But I find the talk test to be a pretty reliable indicator day to day of how you're really feeling. And on top of that, I find that the talk test has also been validated against some of those more physiological measures like heart rate goals, and shows to track just as well. So I think you're getting similar information, but in a more user-friendly way with the talk test.
Thanks, Max. And then we have another question. Is there some way to reduce tremors or exercises that tremors won't interfere with as much?
I can't speak to that. I want to see if maybe Dr. Chin has anything to say about that.
It's a good question. It's very tricky because there's a lot of different reasons why a person could have tremors to begin with. And if your tremor is due to a condition like Parkinson's disease, then there are studies to show that people have reduced decline physiologically and in physical movements if they do certain activities. And so very interestingly, boxing happens to be an activity that has been shown to help with movement, the movement part of Parkinson's disease. There is a recent study that came out was helpful in some of the movements of Parkinson's disease. If it's not due to Parkinson's disease, though, I think the most important thing most likely then would be to see a neurologist to see, well, what could be the cause? Oftentimes it could be medication induced or what they would call essential tremor, which in essence means it's something that has developed and they don't have an exact mechanism. And in those cases, there isn't anything specific as far as a therapy that would be used to reduce the tremor. Sometimes neurologists will use medications for Parkinson's disease for people with essential tremor when it becomes debilitating, but we're always very careful about side effects when doing something like that. I do think in general, movement is a very important thing, and things like Tai Chi or yoga could be particularly helpful when it comes to range of motion and that type of movement. But I don't know of any data to really support those claims other than just seeing that in anecdotally in other people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chin. If there's anything, any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're running close to the end of our time together today. So if you come up with something, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll get you the answer back. Just to wrap up here, we have some resources and I'll go ahead and send this PDF out. We have acknowledgements for the Research Center, the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Institute, and Dr. Ozioma. And we have Max and Sarah's contact information, but I'll also put that in the email. And then we do have some upcoming events. This is a quarterly program, and in 2022, we might do every other month. Big news, guys. But our next program will be on medication, supplements, and vitamins via Zoom on December 10th. And then the Alzheimer's Association has a program called Living Well with Chronic Conditions. It's a 7-week consecutive class, and I will send out the flyer for that along with the email. And then just some ways to stay connected. We have a podcast called Dementia Matters. Dr. Chin is the host of that. And we release 2 episodes a month. And then if you want to stay connected to the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and the Alzheimer's Association, we both put out e-newsletters. And I'll include those links in the email as well. And you can also find us on social media. I know quite a few of you saw this on Facebook and decided to attend today. And if you're interested in learning more about the research we do or being a research participant, you can go ahead and submit a form online or reach out to me and we can talk about opportunities available. So I will be sending a follow-up email in the next couple of days, along with, you'll get a package from us with those items we talked about. In that email, we'll also have an evaluation of the program. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to spend this beautiful Friday morning with you, and maybe we can all get outside for a walk in this nice weather.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Sarah and Max, for a wonderful presentation. And to our audience, thank you guys for attending. I did just add a link for those that want the latest news from the NIH about the impact of exercise. Now, this was in mice, so not in us, but we do have this hormone. And really just to show, this field is really rapidly expanding, and the work from Max and Sarah is a part of that. More to come on it, and hopefully we'll have these two as well as others talk in the future about exercise.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you all. Have a great day.